The story of three insane treasure hunters who got away with it. For over 2,000 years ago, the world had never seen wealth like that held by the Persian Empire's last king, Darius. The treasure of the Achaemenids was a wonder of the ancient world, and when Alexander the Great seized it, he was stunned by its size. The gold alone weighed over 6,000 talents. To put this in perspective, each talent was worth about 75 pounds of gold. So that's over 450,000 pounds of gold just sitting there. But how did all this gold get to the Achaemenid Empire? And how did Alexander feel after finding it? Let's find out in today's episode. First, we have Cyrus the Great, who founded the empire and expanded it to include Lydia and Babylon. He's considered one of the greatest conquerors of all time. Next, we have Cambyses II, who conquered Egypt and added it to the empire. Then we have Darius I, who expanded the empire as far west as Greece and as far east as the Indus River. Darius also built the royal road, which stretched from Susa to Sardis and took 7 years to complete. Finally, we have Xerxes I, who famously led the second Persian invasion of Greece, as depicted in the movie 300. Now that we've met the great Achaemenid kings, let's explore how they lived. The Achaemenid kings were known for their brutality, and they used fear to keep their subjects in line. For example, Cyrus the Great was responsible for the deaths of the last Median king and the Babylonian king. Cambyses II went on a rampage across Egypt and killed anyone who resisted his rule. He was also fascinated by the art and artifacts in Persepolis. He took many of these items with him to Alexandria, where he founded a museum to display them. Unfortunately, the museum was destroyed in the Middle Ages, and only a few artifacts survived. Darius I conquered Thrace and Miletus, then enslaved the people and forced them to work on public projects. In 2014, a group of divers discovered a sunken ship off the coast of Sweden. During World War II, the Nazis looted gold, art, and other valuables from countries across Europe. Much of this treasure was stolen from Jewish families during the Holocaust. First, we should respect the law and protect our cultural heritage. Looting and stealing are wrong and can have serious consequences. Second, we should be aware of the dangers of greed and power. They stole from those who were less fortunate and tried to hide their crimes. The Nazi treasure hunters were driven by greed and power. And third, we should always try to do the right thing. The divers who found the sunken ship could have easily sold the coins on the black market. However, they chose to turn them over to the authorities. After the war, many of the stolen items were recovered, but some were never returned to their owners. In recent years, there have been efforts to track down the remaining Nazi treasure and return it to its rightful owners. However, some groups are trying to profit from the treasure by selling it on the black market. The ship was loaded with silver coins and other valuables. However, the divers were not licensed to salvage the wreck. The coins were eventually seized by the Swedish government and sold at auction. Xerxes I led an invasion force of 180,000 men into Greece and slaughtered thousands of citizens. So it's no surprise that the Achaemenid kings amassed a fortune through conquest. But where did they keep it all? Well, the answer is once again simple. The discovery of the Staffordshire hoard in 2009 was one of the most important archaeological finds in Britain since the discovery of the Rosetta Stone. The hoard consisted of over 1,500 Anglo-Saxon artifacts, including jewelry, weapons, and treasure. It was discovered by two metal detectorists named Eric Laws and Leighton Davies while searching for relics on private land. However, they didn't realize that they were breaking the law by looting an ancient burial site. As a result, they were convicted of theft and sentenced to 8 months in prison. They stored their treasure in Persepolis, the capital of their empire. Who were the Achaemenids? They were filled with gold, silver, and precious stones. The walls were decorated with intricate paintings and sculptures, and the gardens were designed to impress any visitor. Some of the treasure was used to build new palaces and temples. For example, the temple of Olympian Zeus in Athens was built with Persian treasure. Other items ended up in the hands of private collectors. For example, the British Museum in London has an ivory throne that was probably owned by an Achaemenid king. Still, other items were lost forever. For example, the whereabouts of the legendary staff of Moses are unknown. One of the most famous palaces was that of Darius in Persepolis. He was stunned by the amount of wealth the Persians had accumulated, and he took much of it for himself. After Alexander's death, the empire was divided among his generals, and the Achaemenid dynasty came to an end. It was here that he hosted the satraps or provincial governors and other dignitaries from around the empire. Another famous palace belonged to Xerxes I in Persepolis. It was here that Xerxes watched his army prepare for their invasion of Greece. The Achaemenid kings also had some pretty extravagant tombs. For example, the tomb of Cyrus the Great is still standing today near the city of Pasargadae. It's a UNESCO World Heritage Site and one of the most popular tourist destinations in Iran. To understand where all the gold came from, we have to go back to the origins of the empire. The origin story of the Achaemenid Empire is one of humble beginnings. Cyrus the Great founded the empire in 559 BC in the arid lands of Persia. At the time, the region was known as Anshan, but under Cyrus's rule, it would grow to become the largest empire the world had ever seen. What he actually found was way beyond his wildest dreams. Most rulers keep their treasures in one or two places, but not the Achaemenid kings. They spread their wealth around. When Alexander and his men pillaged the city, they found 5 hidden treasuries. The first was in the temple of the sun god, Mithra, where they found gold, silver, and jewels. The second was in the palace of the king, where they found even more gold, as well as elephant tusks and other exotic goods. The third was in the royal treasury, where they found an unbelievable 2,000 talents of gold. The fourth was in the House of the Thousand, where they found furniture made of ivory and gold. And the fifth was in the House of the Magians, where they found magical objects like the legendary staff of Moses. Altogether, Alexander's men found over 6,000 talents of precious metals and thousands of pounds of precious gems. His heirs would conquer vast swaths of land from Central Asia to Egypt, and as far west as Turkey. By the time of Darius the Great, the empire covered an area of 2,200 miles. In fact, the only empires larger were those of Genghis Khan and the British Empire. That impressive feat of empire building is not why the Akkadians became so rich, though. Instead, it was their tolerance that set them apart from other empires of the day. Unlike the Greeks who fought endless wars with their neighbors and the Egyptians who kept slaves, the academics focused on trade and cultural exchange. They encouraged merchants to travel freely throughout the empire, and they protected travelers along the Silk Road. This policy paid off big time, as the Achaemenids became the biggest producers and consumers of luxury goods. Since they controlled most of the trade routes in the region, merchants had to pay steep taxes to sell their wares in Achaean markets. This produced a huge influx of revenue for the empire, Achaemenid kings and their riches. Now that we know how the empire made its money, let's take a look at some of the most famous Achaemenid kings. The palaces of the Achaemenids were truly a sight to behold. In 330 BC, Alexander the Great invaded and conquered the empire, the fall of the Achaemenid Empire. Unfortunately, the Achaemenid Empire would not last forever. Alexander's men discover the hidden treasure. When Alexander the Great marched his army into Persepolis, he was expecting to find a treasury. How did the treasure get to Persepolis? The answer is quite simple. It was the result of centuries of pillaging. What happened to the treasure? When Alexander the Great seized Persepolis, he took the treasure with him and divided it among his men. But it wasn't just the treasure that Alexander found interesting. Now let's move on to our next story, the fate of 3 insane treasure hunters. These treasure hunters got away with the loot of a lifetime, but they also paid a heavy price for it. Here's another story of treasure hunters who got caught. And finally, let's look at the case of the Nazis' lost treasure. What can we learn from these stories? There are many lessons we can learn from the stories of these treasure hunters. Thanks for watching. Subscribe and comment below with video suggestions. See you next time.